Good morning, afternoon and evening to everyone who is taking the call, and a warm welcome to everyone on this first IPBES online conference, which is dedicated to a future IPBES Nexus Assessment. So what we want to do this afternoon is to try and put our heads around what the future IPBES assessment on this nexus would look like and what it could contain. And what we are really talking about is about this important development topic related to water, to food, and to health, and to think about how they relate to each other and to biodiversity and climate change. And our ultimate goal is to try and see how we can simultaneously reach all of these sustainable development goals and not reach one or two at the expense of the others, and in particular at the expense of biodiversity, which is often what happens. So my name is Larigauderie. I'm the Executive Secretary of IPBES, and it's a pleasure to welcome you on the call. In a moment, I will invite our first speaker, Luthando Dziba. I believe you can see him here on the screen, to introduce this nexus topic a little bit, and then to focus on our first topic, which is water for today. But first, I would like to really give a quick overview of IPBES to really bring people who might not ever have heard about IPBES to a good level of understanding, so they can contribute to the conversation and help us flesh out what this future IPBES report could include and the types of questions that it could address. So I will now switch to my first slide here. I have about 15 minutes of presentation. So IPBES, which released its global assessment in May 2019, in fact, already has a bit of a long history, and it came from two major events which took place in 2005. The first one was the release of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and the realization that the community did not have a mechanism to repeat this type of exercise, and also didn't have the way to really truly involve governments. And that same year, France hosted a conference where the president of France at the time, President Chirac, called for an IPCC-like mechanism for biodiversity, which then triggered a worldwide consultation, which in 2012 led to the establishment of IPBES, and in 2014 in the approval and initiation of the first work program of IPBES. We are moving swiftly along. If we can make the slides move. So this is now IPBES in a nutshell, and in this presentation I will say a few words about the first work program, which just ended, and then we'll turn towards this new work program up to 2030. For you, of course, to know that IPBES is an independent intergovernmental mechanism. We have 132 governments as members. We also have a collaborative partnership arrangement with 4 UN organizations, UNEP, UNESCO, FAO, and UNDP, and we are hosted by Germany in Bonn. So, looking now at this first work program, which just ended with the release of the global assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services, I believe that it is fair to say that IPBES assessments have established the knowledge base for decision-making over these 5 years of intense work by the community out there. It started with the first 2 assessments in 2016 on pollination and on methods related to scenarios and models. It then was followed by the release in 2018 of 5 reports, 4 regional assessments of biodiversity and ecosystem services in Africa, Europe and Central Asia, Americas and Asia, and the Pacific, as well as a land degradation and restoration assessment. And then this past May, the release of the global assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services. But of course, IPBES is more than assessments, and over the course of these 5 years, IPBES has been at the forefront of a number of innovative approaches, including the IPBES conceptual framework, which really promotes an integrative approach to issues related to biodiversity, not only looking at trends in biodiversity change, but also looking at the direct causes, the indirect causes, the impact that has on the quality of life of people around the world, as well as projections of future trajectories and also options for action. IPBES has also come up with a new approach to recognize and work with indigenous and local knowledge, which has been fully implemented in the context of the global assessment. We have an ambitious capacity building program as well, among other things, as methods to address knowledge gaps, and so work hand in hand with the scientific community, which can then address these gaps and enrich the body of knowledge for the future work of IPBES. Of course, none of that would have been possible with the involvement of a huge community that includes the governments that are members of IPBES, but also the thousands of scientists and other knowledge holders who have been investing for free on a voluntary basis their time and their idea in IPBES, really motivated by the idea that more knowledge can really inform better decision-making towards more positive outcome towards biodiversity. A huge body of scientific publications has been analyzed, as you can see here, and during this journey, tens of thousands of comments have been received by people around the world that are so crucial to the scientific quality and credibility of what IPBES does. I share 4 slides very quickly so that it gives you a sense of some of the key findings of the global assessment, the latest report in the series of IPBES reports of the first work program. This one has become a little bit of an emblematic slide for that global assessment, and it says here that 1 million animal and plant species are threatened with extinction out of an estimated total of 8 million. And that includes, for example, 40% of our amphibians or 30% of our reef-forming corals. Another conclusion is related to nature's contribution to people, which based on more than 2,000 publications shows that there is overall a deteriorating trend in the world. These have been classified by IPBES in 18 categories, but 3 broad categories: material, non-material, and regulation. And what the slide shows here is that the global positive trends in material contributions, such as the production of food or energy, have been obtained at the expense of the other types of contributions, the regulating contributions, for example, pollinators on top, which are so crucial to agriculture, which are declining, or the capacity of our ecosystems to regulate climate or to provide fresh water, for example, but also at the expense of the non-material contributions, such as learning, inspiration, or supporting identities. All of these contributions that give us a sense of place, a sense of identity, and which are also so crucial and which IPBES values very much. Another conclusion was that most of the Aichi biodiversity targets will be missed, and that is a very key aspect of the global assessment, as it will form the basis for the discussions next year at COP15 to negotiate the post-2020 biodiversity framework. This slide here shows that only some components of only 4 of the 20 Aichi targets have shown some good progress. And finally, and that is something that is very important, that this assessment, like all of the other IPBES assessments do, they conclude that there is still time to act, and they also assess options for action. And this is what this slide does here in the context of feeding humanity while conserving biodiversity, just some examples. So IPBES has already had quite a few significant impacts, and we have on our website a little tool which we call Track, which attempts to list some of the impacts that we become aware of. I will certainly not go through all of this list here, but just flagging a few. For example, the approval by the Convention on Biological Diversity of a plan of action on pollinators based on the IPBES pollination assessment, or an increasing number of national strategies regarding pollinators protection, also triggered by the IPBES pollination assessment, or more recently, the G7 leaders approving biodiversity charter. First time that the biodiversity was a main focus on the G7 agenda. So that brings us now to the second work program of IPBES. So the first work program really established knowledge foundations regarding biodiversity. And the second work program, which we call the IPBES work program up to 2030, is going to really try to inform transformative change. There are 3 topics that have been prioritized by the plenary when it met last in Paris this past April, May. And these topics are as follows. The first one is the topic for today, the Nexus, how to reach simultaneously sustainable development goals related to food, health, water, climate, and biodiversity. The second one has to do with the underlying drivers of change, things that relate to values, to behavior, how then they impact institutional changes or economic decisions, and how then that affects direct drivers and biodiversity. Underlying drivers remain something that is in need of more work, and this is what the assessment would do. And then the third topic is dedicated to business, and it would study the impact of different types of businesses on biodiversity, and also assess the types of methods that exist to monitor the impact that these different types of business sectors have on biodiversity. And so today we focus on this first topic here, which is the Nexus for short, as we call it. A few points about this new work program. There would be many things to say, of course, and it's been quite a process to arrive to the selection of these 3 topics here. But an important one is that this is a rolling work program, and in the IPBES language, this means that these 3 topics are only a first set of topics, but that there will then be the possibility to add new topics as the program develops further at about midway through its life. So not everything is set in stone at the beginning of the program. A second important point is that these topics and everything that IPBES does really is 100% request driven. And this is, of course, the case for this work program, and these 3 topics were based on a huge number of requests and suggestions that were put to IPBES from governments, but also from multilateral environmental agreements, which really have the advantage of grouping and representing many countries, and as well as other stakeholders. So you can see here the Biodiversity Convention, CITES Convention on the Trades of Endangered Species, Ramsar on wetland, the Convention on Migratory Species, on combating desertification, and the World Heritage Convention. That is a very important point. And the third one is that, of course, as everything that IPBES does, we talk about assessment, but that includes all of these other types of activities that would also be geared towards addressing those topics. I'm thinking about the implementation of the indigenous and local knowledge approach, capacity building, and all of the other activities. So coming now to this online conference, and this is my last slide here to really orient us on what we're doing this week with this online conference. So the journey towards the Nexus Assessment starts here and now today. We're here at what we call this pre-scoping conference. This is a bit of an innovation for IPBES. We've never really done this before. The idea is to allow a large number of people to have a voice, to contribute to brushing out the contours of what this assessment could address in terms of a question. That's what we're doing today. We're collecting your input, and you will be invited to propose in particular questions that you feel would be important for that future assessment. Then we would have a scoping meeting early next year. There is a call that is currently still open until 15th of October for applying to be invited to be part of this scoping meeting. There will be a selection. Of course, it would be a smaller group, which is why it is important to have this pre-scoping now to allow a larger group to give their views. And the goal of that scoping meeting would be to produce a scoping report. This is a small document that includes the overall structure of the report. It's a bit of a roadmap for a new assessment. It includes the number of chapters, bullet points on what each one of these chapters would address. There is a timeline, a budget, and based on that, then the plenary would meet and consider that report, and with a view to approve it and to initiate the assessment, and then the assessment would start. It is envisaged that it would be 4 years. We will see, depending on what you and others say, what is proposed to plenary. But that would then trigger a call for experts, and they would be working and produce the assessment. So that is where we are today with the pre-scoping. And that really wraps what I wanted to tell you in terms of IPBES, the first work program, the new work program, and then today starting to really think about what one of its key products could look like and the types of questions it would address. So with this then, I would like to now introduce our speaker, Luthando and Dziba, in a few seconds. Following his presentation, you will have the opportunity to ask a few questions for clarification on his intervention, and then we would move to the sequence where you would be invited to contribute your questions as input to the scoping document. So we'll come back in more details on how we want to structure this discussion. Luthando is with the South African national parks. He also has had a lot of input and contributions to IPBES. He is the former co-chair of the regional assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services for Africa, and is the current co-chair of the multidisciplinary expert panel of IPBES, who is advising the plenary and the Bureau on scientific issues. So Luthando is first introducing the Nexus as a whole, and then he will introduce the topic of water so that we can then have a conversation on the water, which is topic 1. So with this, I hand over to Luthando, thanking you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Anne. I hope you can hear me. Can you confirm? Sounds good, thanks. Thank you very much for joining us for this e-conference. I want to start by confirming, as Anne has already said, that today we will focus on just one element of the Nexus assessment, but I will start with a broader introduction of the Nexus and then present aspects related to water interlinkages. And then from then we will then take a few questions of clarity and then take general inputs, particularly around what you consider to be important questions that this assessment should address. I'm on slide 2. Can you see that? Are you moving with me? Can you confirm, Benedict?
Yes, we can follow it very well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So the assessment basically will focus on assessing the interlinkages among biodiversity, climate change, water, food, and health. And as within the IPBES language, it is a thematic assessment because it focuses on a set of themes, as mentioned. It is outlined in the current draft decision, which was taken by plenary to support the work program up to 2030 as an assessment that will focus on food, water, and health, but with direct interlinkages to biodiversity and climate change. And today we will focus on water and related interlinkages. Tomorrow on day 2 will be health and associated interlinkages. And then on the 3rd day, there will be a focus on food and interlinkages, as well as a synthesis to close this part of the e-scoping of this assessment. This is a rough schematic that we prepared just as a way of capturing at a high level what the assessment is going to be dealing with. But there are obviously a number of other elements that are or could be considered important to add to this, and we would like to hear from you about that. For instance, one of the most common nexus that you see is the food, energy, water nexus. From very simple, representation or schematic or conceptual representation of that to very complex ones like this one. But the point is that there is scope for us to think about what else should be added to the assessment and what interlinkages should we be looking at. And that is what we would like to hear more from you. There's others, for instance, like this one from the PBL, which also includes land. And I think land captures aspects of biodiversity and includes energy. And in our case, we have, in the case of the IPBES assessment, included health where energy is, but there is room, for, obviously, for us to add energy, and while at the same time, we consider health. And that is something that we have said is definitely open up for discussion. So what is the history of the concept of nexus and its framing? I think I mean, the nexus as a concept, and particularly the consideration of interlinkages and connections is really very, very old. But I think a focus from the 70s in terms of discussions, particularly considering the fact that there was by then a realization that we would overshoot the production capacity of the earth, given the rate at which we were growing human population, as well as increasing industrial activity. And but I think this was really crystallized at the Bonn conference in 2011, which focused on the water, energy, and food security nexus solutions for the green economy. And I think this conference elevated the nexus to prominence in both policy and development discourse, as well as in the academia or the research community in general. And I think that as a result of this conference, there were a number of platforms that were spared. There is, for instance, a Nexus platform, which has got a number of very good discussions and dialogues that have taken place at regional level, at interbasin level, and at various national levels. And I think that it is a good community of practice that should contribute to this work going forward. So Nexus really refers broadly to connections, interlinkages, and also takes into account integration, or seeks to take into account integration. I liked two definitions in some of the literature that I consulted about this, which one is Simpson and Jewett's paper from February this year, which defines the water, food, energy nexus, the water, energy, food nexus as the study of the connections between these three sectors together with the synergies, conflicts, and trade-offs that arise from how they are managed, and particularly water for food, food for water, energy for food for water, water for energy, and food for energy, energy for food. So basically, you've got these forward and backward linkages between each one of the sectors, and I think then a synthesis that seeks to integrate all of them. And Stringer and colleagues have identified or have highlighted that Nexus thinking highlights relationships, interdependencies, and the need for integrated decision-making across sectors in a way that takes into account risk-based decision processes. And I think in this light, IPBES also strongly recognizes the interlinkages among the global goals, particularly within the context of the Sustainable Development Goals of food and water security, of health for all, of protecting biodiversity on land and underwater, and also of combating climate change. And IPBES recognizes these as indivisible and as integrated because there is a view that recognizes that in order for us to meet societal and economic development goals, we need to have a healthy biosphere that underpins these, that all of these goals basically are integrated and that they are basically embedded within each other. I think that in the articulation then of the Nexus assessment within IPBES so far, and I think that this is part of what we want to continue to develop, a number of interlinkages have been recognized as needing attention, including the synergies, core benefits, and trade-offs. For instance, among the following interlinkages: the health of people, crops, livestock, soil, wildlife, and the environment, and taking into account the One Health approach. Interlinkages between food production and biodiversity, including, for instance, control of pests and diseases, pollination, as well as interlinkages among fertilizers, crop nutrition and productivity, water quality, biodiversity, as well as greenhouse gas emissions, dietary diversity and health, composition and diversity of human microbiome and biodiversity, climate mitigation and adaptation strategies, as well as how these could affect biodiversity. The global assessment team of experts considered these and in a way came up with a very aspirational nexus in a landscape infographic, which looks, among other things, at a number of competing drivers of change and perhaps how in the future these might be managed in such a manner that you can get the kind of outcomes that basically balance, for instance, food provision from oceans and coasts with nature protection, or meeting climate goals while maintaining nature and nature's contributions to people, or, for instance, conserving and restoring nature while contributing positively to human well-being, among others. And I think that we know for sure, based also on the outcome of the global assessment, that life on Earth has not been like that so far, that we are seeing that life on Earth is deteriorating fast, and this is happening worldwide. The regional assessments as well confirmed these trends in each one of the sub-regions or in each one of the regions. Basically, virtually all indicators of the global state of nature are decreasing from biomes to breeds, and the drivers that are driving this change or this loss of biodiversity are basically projected to increase from indirect as well as direct drivers. Indirect drivers such as demographic change. The global population is expected to increase, and we see that the proportion of that population that will become middle class is also projected to increase, and we know that with that there are projected changes in preferences that will lead to increased consumption of some of the water demanding products, such as beef, for instance. We know that institutions and governments are challenging areas, as well as areas where we see conflicts. And all of these contribute to various drivers such as land use change, overexploitation of resources, climate change, as well as pollution and invasive alien species, among other drivers of changes in terrestrial, marine, as well as freshwater systems. I think a very sobering picture is this, picture, which is really, powerful in communicating the fact that water is a very, very important resource. Basically, if you take out water from the earth, the volume of water is about 1.4 billion cubic kilometers of water. And of this, basically, is seawater, or salt water, which makes up about 97% of all water that we have. And I think if you look at the proportion of that is fresh water, you see that that is very small. And of that, basically, about an even smaller proportion in freshwater lakes, rivers, and wetlands is basically the water that is available for humanity to live on. And most of the other water is really inaccessible. And I think that this speaks to water as a very important resource that must be managed and I think valued appropriately as part of the contributor or of the contributing resources to the discussion on Nexus. I want to briefly take us through a couple of water interlinkages to food, to health, as well as to biodiversity, or how water relates to biodiversity and climate. If you look at global water use, this graphic from work or from a paper by Johan Rockstrom and colleagues shows that basically if you look at global trade of agricultural products, from 1900. It has increased from about 1950. It has increased quite substantially, you know, from basically very, you know, low, I guess, to basically a point where now our trade is more than 6 times what it was at the beginning of the last century. Similarly, if you look at the area equipped for irrigation, it has increased quite substantially over the last century. But as well as is obstruction of groundwater, which is that red line. But with that, there has also been an increase in basically water shortage for billions of, you know, our people. And I think that this challenge is going to be even exacerbated by projected, you know, climate change, particularly declines in precipitation and increases in temperature, which will increase evapotranspiration in many parts of the world. One of the questions that this raises then is the fact that we have seen basically since about 1980 very significant fluctuations in food production, particularly maize production, which are very tightly linked to estimates of production that are related to heat stress and drought. And I think that the point that the authors are making of this paper is the fact that if you track basically what we see as food production over the last couple of years, you can see that it is very tightly linked to heat stress and drought. And so if future projections then suggest that there will be you know, even more limited water available or increased temperature resulting to increased evapotranspiration, then one can project that there will certainly be declines in maize production, and this perhaps might be the new normal that we must take into account. But the assessment experts for the global assessment obviously considered other options, particularly land use options that might lead to a change of course that is away from business as usual, and suggest that land sparing, which is basically efficient use of land for production, but sparing other land for conservation, might actually be one of the options available to decision makers. But also another option is basically mixed land use systems where natural elements of the landscape are interwoven with productive landscapes, but with the view that more ecologically friendly, so to speak, ways of production, such as intercropping, agroforestry, conservation agriculture, among others, might actually contribute to maintaining healthy ecosystems and leaving some land for conservation in the meantime. But I think one of the big ones, which I think affects everybody, is really around what they call caring or consumption change. And here, this one requires behavior change, particularly reduction in waste, increase in recycling, focusing on less resource-intensive consumption, moderating, or such as moderating, for instance, consumption of red meat and dairy products. And I think that the question really, like, I mean, as to why this is important is really illustrated by this point about water footprints. For instance, to produce a bar of chocolate, it takes about 1 liter. Produce 1 apple takes about 35 liters. But to produce a glass of milk, you need about 250 liters of water. And to produce a beef steak or a portion of beef, you need about or close to 2,000 liters of water. And obviously, if we are to make significant contributions towards reducing our resource-intensive consumption patterns, then we need to consider cutting some of those that have got higher water footprints. I like this work of Puo and Nemesek, which was published in Science last year, and this illustration by the BBC of basically the greenhouse gas emissions of basically beef as compared to many other sources of protein. And you can see that it stands out quite far out as really like a big emissions or gas emissions or greenhouse gas emissions producer. And I think that considerations for options need to take into account these kinds of data, particularly when it comes to both greenhouse gas emissions as well as water consumption. I think another issue that arises is that of food trade, particularly because sometimes our local impacts might not show up as that significant, but because we might import food. But taking into account these teleconnections and particularly regional as well as global exports and imports of food, one is in a position to take into account embedded water use and interbasin transfers of water. And I think that these are some of the considerations that I think an assessment like this should take into account. When it comes to health, a number of factors, particularly in developing countries where there's very poor sanitation as well as management or infrastructure for managing water in general. These lead in particular, and I think this fact is true everywhere, chemical runoff from both agriculture as well as human waste, including increased nitrate and phosphorus concentrations in water, nitrate loads into salt marshes, land applications of biosolids, as well as common insecticides used in urban and agricultural areas. And all of these contribute in one or the other to basically affecting health, either through pollution, direct pollution of water, drinking water. I mean, if you look at the lady, is basically collecting water from basically near ablution facilities. There are people that collect water downstream from streams that are polluted like this, and many other, similar situations that we know of in developing countries. And so poor sanitation and drinking water like this remains a huge challenge for humanity. I think there are other emerging and or intensifying pressures in inland freshwater systems, such as, for instance, obstruction of water, particularly to meet growing demand for water resources. The poor state of wastewater treatment works in many countries. I think an emerging issue around microplastics as well as pharmaceuticals, particularly used in cosmetics. Invasive species, particularly those that are imported or that brought in for economic benefits, but eventually take over some of these natural systems, or as in South Africa, for instance, emergence of shale gas exploration, then the risks for pollution of groundwater or drawdown of groundwater, which then has got impacts on other either ephemeral aquatic systems or other systems. I think a very interesting example in this regard is one where, for instance, you have as in this medium-sized dam in the Kruger National Park, where during normal years hippos would basically be living in these types of systems, but during droughts hippos move into river pools and springs and create huge amounts of, or produce some huge amounts of waste, and might cause eutrophication, harmful algal blooms, and even spread some of the diseases into the systems and downstream to basically users who might not even be aware of some of the impacts happening upstream. I think the assessment should also consider national level as well as basin level studies, such as looking at entire basins like the Niger Basin, particularly in the context of future climate changes, looking at strategic water source areas and their contribution to development and human well-being, and to multiple sectors, whether it's agriculture, mining, and the like. I think I want to end there and perhaps invite questions of clarity, and then after that, we will then take contributions from everybody who has joined us for this teleconference. With that,